Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us here today. Welcome to everybody in the room and welcome to anybody who is watching online. So for those who haven't come here before, this is my scrutiny meeting where I have the opportunity to scrutinise the Chief Constable and by her proxy, the team, to talk about how the police are performing. So today, I take a thematic approach to this. So today we are focusing on support for victims and safer communities with a particular focus on tackling violence against women and girls. Now, obviously, in the kind of light of recent events with the tragic murder of Ava White and obviously another woman who is also, the investigations are going for that one as well, I think it kind of highlights the importance of this agenda as to why we are talking about this today. So we'll go through the slides and go through some of the data, and then I've got a series of questions. So lots of you will be aware as well that I've had some questions submitted from the public, so we will be asking those questions on their behalf as well. So if we just do introductions, just for, again, new faces and people who might be watching online. So as I say, I'm Emily Sporrell, I'm the Police and Crime Commissioner. I forgot my title then, Police and Crime Commissioner. So if we do my office first, so Sue.
Afternoon, everybody. Sue McTaggart, Interim Chief Executive for the Police and Crime Commissioner.
Hi, John Riley, Chief Finance Officer for the Police and Crime Commissioner.
Kim Dawson from the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner.
Okay, and then if we do, should we start with you, Serena, and then we'll go around?
Yeah, Serena Kennedy, Chief Constable, Merseyside Police.
Ian Critchley, Deputy Chief Constable.
Nari Wayne, Assistant Chief Constable, Investigation and Intelligence.
Keith Dickinson, Director of Resources at Merseyside Police.
Jonathan Davies, Chief Superintendent, Head of Matrix and Head of Force Ops.
Amanda Ross, Analytics and Evaluation Manager, Merseyside Police.
Matt Boyle, Temporary Assistant Chief Constable, People Services.
Janice Sloaney, Business Support, Merseyside Police.
Okay, and then John online, and then Natalie.
Good afternoon. Assistant Chief Constable John Roy, responsible for local policing, criminal justice and preventative policing.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Natalie Perishini, Chief Superintendent and Head of Corporate Support and Development.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We've also had apologies from Rob Carden, who's Assistant Chief Constable for Response and Resolution. But Jonathan, you're here for him, aren't you? And then Louise Kane, Head of Performance, is also sent apologies. And we have Amanda subbing for her. So thank you both for that. Okay, right, we will crack on then because there is a lot of data to go through, and as the Chief will know, I've got a lot of questions, so we will work through them as quick as we can. So, Chief, do you want to take us through the first slides?
Yeah, so what we'll do, Commissioner, is Amanda will present the data on the slides, and then we will, the appropriate Chief Officer is then available for the questions and explanations.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name's Amanda Jane Ross. I'm one of the Analytics and Evaluation Managers with the Merseyside Police. Today, we're going to be discussing police performance against some of the themes within the PCC's Police and Crime Plan, which will be referred to as pillars. The areas for focus today relate to Pillar 2, supporting victims, and safer communities. We shall also make mention of a specified information order, which the PCC is required to publish and provides information relating to Merseyside Police Force performance against government national priorities for policing. These measures are intended to complement the Merseyside Police and Crime Plan 2021-25. Okay, so the first crime type we're going to look at today is domestic abuse. This slide depicts the long-term trend of the domestic abuse crime rate from April 2018 to September 2021, together with the corresponding positive outcome rate. Financial year to date, 2020-21, Merseyside have recorded a total of 26,127 domestic abuse crimes, compared to 24,864 for the same period in 2019-2020. This is an increase of around 5%. We believe that increases in volumes can be attributed to lockdown restrictions easing, resulting in increased visibility and accessibility to victims. The number of individuals deemed to be new victims of DA observed an increase during lockdown and also led to more seeking help. However, since this time, we have since experienced month-on-month reductions in the number of reports of domestic abuse. Over the pandemic period, Merseyside has mirrored that of the national picture. Both Refuge and Women's Aid have experienced increases in users visiting their sites, chat rooms and telephones. The reduction in outcome rates can also be attributed to the type of offence occurring. We are seeing higher solved rates for those offences which involve an injury, which is stable at around 14%, compared to much lower rates for those without injury, which often result in outcome 16, which is when a victim declines or withdraws support when there is a named suspect identified. Conversely, we also have outcome 15, which is an instance where there is a named suspect and a victim supports action, but there are evidential difficulties. In total, outcome 15 and 16 account for around 86% of all domestic outcomes. These account for 70% of male and outcomes, compared to 67% of female victims. For the previous 12 months, the trend for outcome 16 rate has largely been consistent, residing between 65% and 70%. For the previous 12 months, outcome 15 has also been consistent, accounting for between 16 and 21% of D outcomes per month. We are unable to compare our performance against other forces or almost similar group, as there are differing measures in place to ensure accuracy, and we use a flag for domestic abuse as opposed to the crime type. In terms of repeat victim identification, we have an inbuilt query within our management information system within Merseyside Police that extracts our repeat victims of domestic abuse, which is subsequently discussed within the Protecting Vulnerable People meeting. And we also have a Violence Against Women and Girls dashboard, whereby we extract data on all features pertaining to violence against women and girls and offending and vulnerability. This is inclusive of DA.
Okay, thank you. You've preempted a number of my questions there, so it was very thorough. Thank you for that. In terms of the outcome 15 and 16 then, what are we doing as a force to try and reduce the numbers who might be, or evidential difficulties, or reduce the numbers of victims who might, pull out the charge?
Commissioner, one of the key things we're doing at the moment is a DA intensification. This is the third year that we've run this during November and December, aligns with the 16 days of action to reduce or eliminate violence against women and girls. This year, in particular, we put in place a quality assurance team to actually look at DA investigations in real time so that we can learn what are common things we can do to improve, in particular, evidence-led prosecution. So they're prosecutions where, even though the victim isn't willing to make a statement, we look at other things, other lines of inquiry so that we can actually get a charge from the CPS. I think we've also, and it's actually been an action that's come from HMIC, we've reviewed all 15s and 16s. CSD have done that work and come up with a number of recommendations, and those recommendations are being built into the DA intensification 2 months of practice. But at the end of those 2 months, there will be a report as to where we can make further improvements, what things worked, particularly around evidence-led prosecutions. And added into that, we're developing our technology so that it's much easier for us to see when we've got evidence-led prosecutions. No forces are able to record this simply, and we have been using a spreadsheet, but we're going to be putting this into our systems, Delphi, so that it's much easier to see and then look at what works, etc. Added to that, we're working with the CPS. The CPS have been doing CPD inputs to officers with our PVP unit to really look at how we can get evidence-led prosecutions, and they're involved in that because it's really important that the CPS are with us on that and are willing to authorise a charge even if the victim doesn't feel in a place to be able to make a statement.
Okay, thank you for that. So then in terms of the wider outcome rates, which obviously have fallen, did you say, sorry Amanda, that was predominantly related to the outcomes 15 and 16, or is there additional work being done to look at outcomes outside of that particular category?
So generally, this particular one relates to outcome 15 and 16, but to be fair, we look at all outcomes in relation to lessons learned to think around if there's anything we could have done better to improve service in right across the board from outcome 1 right the way through to outcome 22. So albeit the focus is on 15 and 16 for domestic abuse, we do look generally at all outcomes.
Yeah, just to add to what Mandy said, the increase in domestic abuse, a lot of it is violence without injury and stalking and harassment and things like that, which are notoriously harder to get a charge on because obviously the evidence isn't as obvious. So with the increases being in those areas, that has affected our outcomes.
So is there anything that we can do that we're not already doing in terms of, because I know what you're saying, it does get difficult when it's kind of, I guess he said, she said is what you get down to. Is there any work that's being done nationally, do you know, in terms of how we look at that and how do we respond to that to maximise the outcomes for it?
Commissioner John may also want to come in, but I sit on the national gold group around violence against women and girls, where the national policing lead for domestic abuse sits, the national lead for rape, I do for the national lead for child protection, and some of the issues that we're seeing here are common across the board, particularly in terms of the criminal justice piece. CPS are heavily engaged in that. We've seen a change in terms of CPS moving from effectively from the station to a direct service to one that is more remote, and that now is being heavily looked at in terms of our close working, as Nari mentions, in terms of being able to bring that as close to the charging decision as we need to do, because we know if we don't make a charge, particularly while somebody's in custody, there is more of the opportunity, understandably, particularly around coercion and control of a victim, not necessarily wanting to pursue complaint, recognising we will seek to pursue evidence-led prosecutions. It becomes more difficult in that regard. We have seen reduced outcomes in all these areas around it, and Merseyside is not dissimilar to other areas in that regard, and that work that requires across the whole system, CPS, courts, to make it easier to progress outcomes from first point right through to convictions. There is other work in train in that regard. There is some issues around disclosure, which I don't think necessitates a detail around this, but means that investigators are doing more work at the front end. And again, in order to pursue a charge, it's taking additional hours to do that, to get to a case that's sufficient for CPS to give advice on as well. And of course, a lot of the cases now involve a lot of digital evidence. Now, you're aware of the work and the innovative work that's going on across Merseyside, but many of these cases now involve the examination of digital devices. That evidence is required again in order to get to a point of threshold, in order to get to a point of charge. Again, some of that advanced time then means that we see more withdrawal. We are absolutely committed to increasing opportunities at a national level, as well as the work that you've heard Nairi outline at Merseyside.
Okay, thank you, Ian. So in terms of ongoing protections then, so do we know how many, I'm going to get this wrong, domestic violence protection orders and domestic violence protection notices? Do we know how many Merseyside issue in a year and how effective they are and how they're monitored?
Okay, I can respond to the volume. So November 20 to October 21, there were 535 DVPNs, with 505, 95% becoming DVPOs. Ari?
Yeah, we know that we're in the top 5 forces in the country for giving out DVPOs per 1,000 population. So we do use these extensively. Added to that, we make sure that the local policing teams are aware when a DVPO has been given out, and they will actively police that. So it's not just that we give them, we do actually police them as well in terms of going and visiting the victim and making sure that they've got the support they need. And then obviously there are third sector organisations who can then put that support in for 28 days when we've got that separation between the victim and the offender. So we do use them extensively, we do police them, and we do arrest people for breach, and we have had people actually being remanded as a result of breaching their DVPOs.
Do you think that they're effective at actually reducing abuse?
I think they're effective in some cases and not in others. The truth of the matter is every one of these cases is an individual. We do have some repeat, people who've had several DVPOs, and you'd have to say how effective are those. We are at the moment looking at some repeat perpetrators and seeing whether there's some work we can do about an ongoing course of conduct, which would be different from the DVPO, but also won't rely on the victim. So there's work ongoing. So they work sometimes, but not always.
When they were I thought it was on. When they were introduced, they were piloted in a number of forces and areas within those forces, and evaluated and then subject to further evaluation once they'd been introduced. I think it's a really difficult question to answer in terms of are they effective. I think the importance is what that 28 days is used for. So from a policing perspective, it's absolutely around our role in compliance with the notice or the order once it's been issued by the court. And then it's the work that we do, I think, with our partners to that 28-day gap for the offender behaviour to be looked at, but also in terms of the support into the victims, survivors, in terms of that planning. What is it we can do to support the individuals to make the decision to leave the relationship safely or remain in the relationship safely? So I think it's the planning in that period, but it's there is no doubt a capacity issue in terms of the number of people that are able to get access to that intensive support during that 28-day period. And I think John's hand's gone up.
Yes, John.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's where the Violence Reduction Partnership can come in, and some of the work that we're starting to look at is how we can intervene more effectively in that space and fund and develop those interventions. But also with a national hat on, when we move towards the presumption to pre-charge bail rather than offenders being released under investigation, there is the potential that we're looking at in conjunction with West Yorkshire Police to link DVPOs and DVPNs to bail, which would give us, it would strengthen our toolbox really for protecting victims and monitoring and managing offenders. So that works in train.
Great, thank you, John. So a question that I've had from the public around, well, it was a contact that I had from the public around a particular issue, which was around the use of MG6Is and how they're being used to safeguard victims and their families. And I think somebody had not had the best experience of the use of an MG6I. Could you just explain what they're used for and what your kind of approach is from this side?
Yeah, MG6Is are used for where someone's charged and is before the court. They're used to ensure that if they're remanded in prison, the prisons know of the vulnerability of the victims and so don't allow the offender to make contact with the victim or the victim's family. That's how they're utilised. We do use them. Added to that, we have officers in the domestic violence court, which a lot of places don't have, so they will check the file when it's being handed over to the defence and to the prosecutor to check whether there should be a MG6I on there. Similarly, our police decision makers will highlight if there should be a MG6I on the file. So we do have a number of gateways and checks to ensure that those forms are filled in if someone's going to be remanded in custody. We haven't recently had any concerns raised by the courts or the prisons around that. I know that in the past there has been a complaint, but it was quite a specific, unusual case actually, that one. So they are utilised. Our officers understand them, and when we've done checks, they have been on the files.
And do you work then with the prisons to make sure that they understand what is required for that, and that they then facilitate, they put the order in place?
There is a set process that the prisons understand. They will get the forms and they know what to do with it. It's quite a it's been around for a little while.
Okay, thank you. Another question that we had then from a member of the public was around male victims of domestic abuse. So do we know what percentage of the reported incidents of domestic abuse are made by men? And is there anything in particular that you offer to men around that support?
Okay, so in terms of the proportion, over the last 12 months, 25% across the past 12 months have been a male victim of domestic abuse.
Say that again, sorry, I missed that.
Sorry, over the past 12 months, 25% have been male victims.
Yeah, in terms of what support is given to male victims, whenever we go to a domestic violence incident, the officer will fill in a VPRF, which is a vulnerable persons referral form, and that then goes to our vulnerable persons referral unit. And the job of the VPRU, the unit, is to make sure referrals are sent through to the appropriate agencies. So where it's a male victim, those referrals will go through to the agencies that provide support to men. Now, some of the units, some of the third sector organisations only support women, but the referral unit know which one will support men and women, and they will make sure those referrals go through to the support agencies for men. Now, obviously, if it's a gold victim, then a man will get an IDVA, a domestic violence advocate, to assist them, and they will be discussed in the multi-agency risk conference, the MARAC, to ensure that there's a multi-agency action plan to reduce the risk. So that is about the scoring of the risk, not about the gender of the victim. So they will get the same service there. But if they're not a gold victim, they will be referred through to what provision there is in the local authority for men.
So in terms of then the broader response that a victim of domestic abuse might expect from Merseyside Police, so obviously there's the technical side around the risk assessments and the MARACs and those kind of things. When somebody reports an incident of domestic abuse to the police, what response can they expect regardless of gender?
Yeah, I don't want to take up loads of time here, but when we get a call for domestic violence, the control room have what's called call assist, so they'll know whether that household have called us before and what they've called us for. Obviously, an officer will then be deployed to that incident, and whether it's an emergency response or a priority response or a scheduled response will depend on the risk. And that risk is via a template looking at threat, harm, risk, and vulnerability, called the Thrive template. And so, you know, if it's an emergency, if the offender's there and the violence is taking place there, it will be an emergency, and we'll endeavour to get there within 10 minutes. But it depends on, because sometimes people are reporting about, you know, really nasty comments on Facebook, and while that needs to be dealt with, you don't need to get there in 10 minutes because the offender's not there, etc. So the threat isn't as high. So we will always deploy an officer to any domestic violence incident dependent, and the speed of that will depend on the circumstances. For every domestic violence incident, the officer will safeguard the parties who are there. That's their first priority. So whether that means separating, whether that means making sure the children are all right, their first priority is to safeguard the people in the location. And then to look at if there's a crime committed, to ensure that crime is recorded and to take positive action. So if the offender is there and the necessity criteria is met, i.e. we have the power to arrest, they will be arrested. If the offender isn't there, then normally the officer will go and try and find the offender. And if they can't find the offender, then they'll be sent through to our targeted unit, who will, if the arrest needs to take place, will do the arrest. The officers also will complete, as I said, the violence person referral form, which goes through to the vulnerable person's referral unit, which will make sure referrals are made to support that individual. Now, that may be children's services. If there's a child there, it may be to an advocate, depending on what the risk is. Within that form, there is what you sort of think of as an algorithm, a way of calculating risk. And so if someone's high risk, they will be given a domestic violence advocate, and they will be discussed in a multi-agency conference. And every agency will then look to put a plan around that person to support them and to keep them safe. So that's sort of an overview.
No, thank you. And I appreciate it will be different depending on the threat and depending on what the issue is for the particular victim that's reported it. But I think it's just helpful just to remind people as to what goes through and how much work goes on behind the scenes to address the calls for around domestic abuse.
I sort of, obviously it will go to an officer to investigate as well, and the offender will be interviewed, and then the file will be put together to go to the CPS for a charge decision, or go to the police decision maker first. So our aim is to prosecute. Where there's a crime, our aim is to prosecute, and we'll do everything we can to do that.
Okay, so moving on to perpetrators then, in terms of how you identify perpetrators and what work is being done to prevent reoffending.
Yeah, as I, obviously with domestic abuse, generally we know who the perpetrator is because the victim will tell us who the perpetrator is. So generally they will be identified, and I've already said where we will take positive action. So if the criteria is met, we will arrest the offender. If they're not at the scene, then there's a process to make sure that they are brought in as soon as possible, and you know, they are recorded on our systems as wanted if we can't get them in the first 24 hours. And what was the second question about repeat? So preventing reoffending, you will know PCC because I think the money came through the PCC's office to support 3 projects in 3 different local authorities around DA perpetrators, and also child-adult abuse as well. So to look at programmes that address the offending behaviour of the perpetrators. So there's 3 programmes that are quite new because they've only just got the funding. We also have a risk index that's been developed between the PVP, the Policing Vulnerable People Unit, and the Strategic Department, which is identifying the most risky perpetrators. And we're working through that at the moment and looking at what can we do over and above arresting and prosecuting for a particular crime. What can we do with those individuals to ensure that they are targeted if they are going to continue to offend? So that work's developing. And we've actually got a project at the moment with the DI in charge of it, ensuring that we pull all these things together, because obviously you've got your targeted team going out and getting people who are wanted, you've got your risk index, identifying the most risky people, and then you've got your perpetrator programmes that are sitting in the local authorities. So we're working really hard to join them all together, and we're also involved in an N8 police research project that's looking across the Northwest at what programmes are in place across the Northwest for DA perpetrators and how effective they are. So we're linked in with that as well to ensure that we learn from other forces and take the very best practice to build on the work we're already doing.
And then in terms of identifying perpetrators who cross force boundaries, again, I know you'll be aware that I've had cases come through my office where an individual is aware that the ex-abuser has now gone on to abuse somebody else in a different force area. How well are we pulling that together in terms of making sure that somebody isn't repeating their abuse in a different police force or a neighbouring police area?
I mean, obviously, offences get recorded on the PNC, and we also share niche with Cheshire, North Wales. So there is an opportunity there to be able to see people's offending amongst those forces. In terms of, there's also Clare's Law that we use really significantly in terms of both disclosing, when we're asked, disclosing people's previous offending, but also we proactively will tell people about previous offending. So obviously that helps. We know about if that's, they've committed in another force and then come over and got into another relationship and that's abusive. So all those things are in place. I guess the problem with DA is you've got to prosecute the offence that's in front of you. And the fact that someone might have committed DA in another force, you've still got to deal with the offence that's come to light. But certainly we would make sure we shared that information. And as I said earlier, we are looking at where we have repeat perpetrators. Are there other orders we can get in place to protect either the victim there or future victims? So that work's ongoing.
Commissioner, police are one big part of a partnership involving protecting victims from, and particularly perpetrators who are known, and that strand is a key one, because this is about stopping the perpetrator rather than looking at the behaviours of victims and witnesses, of course. And this is where we can stop it. And of course, the probation service are a particularly key partner who, as your office do, in terms of sitting around a meeting that we've all chaired and led on in terms of enhancing our approach to protecting perpetrators. There is something around MAPA arrangements in terms of that higher level crime, in terms of that sharing of information, those that are on licence, in terms of those that then sit across borders. Obviously, there has been discussion over many years now around a register for domestic perpetrators. Clearly, there is, as we know, the sex offenders register, that would ever increase in terms of the numbers that are on there, and would need considerable amounts of consideration in terms of anything that can protect victims from crime needs to be considered. But of course, you've got to consider what the demand is, and as Scenario says, the key bit of this is looking at what is that behaviour, how can we prevent it? Is it alcohol, is it mental health, is it drugs, is there other things within the family? And there is an inordinate amount of work now being led through the project that NARI is leading on, but we need clearly the continued support of all organisations, all agencies, led through what is an enhanced partnership within Merseyside to make a real difference in this area. The relationship risk index, which we've got, we think is innovative. It was highlighted by HMI in their recent visit to us as a national best practice around that highlighting some of those real risky behaviours that we can pick up on and seek to prevent the next crime.
Great, thank you for that. And I suppose it's fair to say there's no easy answers to this, but it is just about how we protect vulnerable people and stop abusers from going on to abuse others, which we do see all too often, sadly. But thank you.
Just
Sorry,
to pick up the point that Nari made in terms of Clare's Law, and the reason the Clare's family went for the law that they did was absolutely a similar set of circumstances to those you outline, and we use Clare's Law in this force. We're one of the top users of Clare's Law in the country, which is a positive because of the training that we've done with our staff on its introduction, but also reminding through the 2-day vulnerability training that we do. But to do the Clare's Law disclosure when you've got perpetrators who may move outside a force area, it depends on what's happened to that offence in the force areas where they've been living before they move on, in terms of what access information we get to, what we get access to. So whether it's a right to know or a right to ask, we are very heavy users of it to protect our victims and survivors further.
Great, that's good to hear. Thank you for that. Should we move on to the victim satisfaction?
Yes. Okay, so staying with domestic abuse. This slide shows the satisfaction rate of domestic abuse victims for the financial year to date over the 5 stages of service, which are ease of contact, action taken, follow-up, treatment and whole experience. Just for context, really, nationally, there are two distinct sources of information for forces to gain information regarding victim satisfaction with the police service and satisfaction with the police among victims of partner abuse. Some of this information can be acquired from the Crime Survey England and Wales, which will form part of the insight into the national review. National View on Satisfaction. So Merseyside Police have also developed two surveys which assist them in gaining invaluable insight into how our crime victims feel about the service that we provide. There are two surveys, the first being a general crime survey, and that asks specific questions relating to 5 key service areas which I've just mentioned. And the second survey specifically surveys victims of domestic abuse and focuses on identical key stages of service. The feedback received permits us to address any shortfalls in service swiftly and appropriately, whilst ensuring that all our crime victims, are dealt with sensitively and professionally. The data caveat here is the fact that despite us sending over 200 surveys per month to the survey company, which is Leicestershire Police, the response rate is between 9 and 13%, so we don't have a massive response rate. The survey is split between those cases which result in outcome 16, which is where the victim declines or withdraws support and there is a named suspect identified, and those that didn't. This allows us to identify any differences in results depending upon the outcome, which can be seen on the graph on the table there. So looking at the longer term picture, the survey's been running since July 2018, and between then and August this year, there have been 1,119 surveys completed. Surveys for the last few months are currently being worked on, and there was delays with the pandemic with results. So looking at results for outcome 16 for the whole period, we submitted 5,356 surveys with a 12.9 response rate. Looking at the 5 stages of satisfaction for outcome 16, the result for whole experience was at 90.3%. And for all other outcomes, there were 3,130 surveys submitted, a response rate of 13.7%. For the 5 stages of service, the satisfaction rate for whole experience was therefore at 85.6%. When you put the two surveys together in terms of the two different outcomes, the overall satisfaction rate for whole experience is at 88.4%. And just to give you a little bit more context as well, we don't stop there, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. When the feedback comes back from our victims, we do some qualitative analysis. It's conducted and the feedback is provided from the DA victim is sent to the vulnerable persons meeting, and also any specific feedback in relation to an officer or a case is sent to the supervisor and the officer, frontline staff. If required, a victim is also contacted to discuss any satisfaction. We've also got a public portal that's going to be piloted, and that should provide more direct communication between the victim and officers and may improve the capability of officers to provide more effective follow-up communication with victims of this crime type.
Okay, thank you for that. So just to clarify, the figures that you quoted then are different to the ones on the screen. So what period does this cover?
So this covers the financial year to date. Was the whole period since we've been doing the actual surveys since July 18.
Okay, thank you. So, albeit it's a small sample, and obviously I'm cognizant of the fact there is a lot of work that does go into this, and some of that from my office as well. And I think there's a host of ways that, again, the Chief will know I raise victim satisfaction at every opportunity. So, albeit it's a small sample, obviously a couple of the areas around follow-up and action taken that seem to be some of the kind of weaker responses. Is there anything in particular we're picking up from those themes around improving the response for victims?
Well, I do want to just point out that ease of contact is really good, shows that people can get through to our control room, which is, is good, particularly as we've had some challenges over the last year. And similarly, treatment, I think that's really encouraging, the satisfaction with treatment, because that shows that our officers are listening to people and are taking them seriously. But in terms of action taken and follow-up, I go back to the DA intensification, that real drive to get evidence-led prosecutions, so to make sure that every line of inquiry is properly explored, whether that's the 999, whether that's the body-worn video, whether that's house-to-house, etc., making sure that we're making the most of every opportunity, and that's really what the DA intensification is looking at. In terms of follow-up, this is something that we've struggled with, and every force struggles with, in terms of keeping in contact with people. We know that it's part of the victims' code of practice. We have, and there's a question later on about that, so I'm not going to go into lots of detail, but we're doing lots of work around that victims' code of practice and making sure that the officers know what the entitlements are, the officers meet the entitlements, and that we have measures to show that. The other thing I'd say is that one of the things out of the DA intensification is actually we're looking at body worn, you know, at the time, and feeding back to officers whether it's good or not so good. So really trying to give people feedback and ensure that they, you know, they're listening and taking every opportunity to support victims.
Some of the amendments that we've made to Delphi, which is our kind of performance tool, include the way in which we're able to track supervisors' reviews of crimes in terms of their timeliness of those reviews. So we've now got really good data around when a supervisor last reviewed a crime. So we've got the kind of quantitative metrics around that to make sure that officers are keeping victims up to date, but also we get the qualitative feedback because through crime scrutiny we do dip samples of the end-to-end journeys of crimes, and we then are able to qualitatively scrutinise what the updates have been like from the victim on the crime in relation to victim contact, but also then the role of the supervisor in supervising the management of that crime. So really good both performance in terms of a quality and a quantitative aspect of that.
Commissioner, I think we had this discussion with HMI as well around outcome 16 and satisfaction rates. I think one of the points is within this is that we will always seek to sometimes take the decisions out of victims' hands, in the sense that we know, as I've talked about in terms of that level of coercive control, that an offender needs to be brought to justice, and we need to assist that in that process. But also what you see here is over 90% satisfaction for whole treatment, even for outcome 16. And outcome 16 doesn't necessarily mean to say there has been a poor service or poor outcome. Indeed, the victim is telling us that they are largely, the majority are satisfied with that service. There are a whole lot of complex factors, as we know, when domestic abuse is reported. That doesn't take away from our desire to seek to bring more offenders to justice and better outcomes, but I think what this does highlight is that if we do things right, an outcome 16 can be seen as the right outcome for a victim, and I think that's just an important point to stress within that, as we continue to seek a desire to bring more offenders to justice. So putting ourselves in also the voice of the victim is really important with us. We know that there are clearly many occasions where we seek to take that decision out, but there are lots of complex facts, you know, and I think this is a really important one. You know, you are right alongside us in terms of how we continue to increase and improve in this area. But I think there is some positivity, not just in terms of the all outcomes, but particularly around the satisfaction where a victim declines or makes a decision not to want to proceed with a case.
Yes, no, I understand what you're saying, and that does make sense. So, I mean, colleagues will be aware that I have a victim needs assessment, and also when I first came into office, I did the Safer Streets survey, and we did ask questions around victim satisfaction, and a lot of the kind of anecdotal feedback that I was getting was around victims having a fear of not being believed by the police or being judged for reporting, or potentially, if the reporting was unsuccessful, that fear then they might be leaving themselves in a more dangerous position. What is your response to that in terms of when we encourage people to come forward and report domestic abuse? How do you kind of address some of those concerns?
Yeah, I mean, those concerns aren't new. We see it in Operation Bluestone and some of the what comes out from victims of rape as well. So it is really important that we're alive to that concern. We, at the moment, are doing, there's an expectation that every officer will do continuous professional development around DA during the DA intensification, and that includes some videos of victims where they talk about their experience. I watched one last week. They're quite, you know, they do make you stop and think. And so it's just to make sure that we continue to remind officers about some of the experiences that victims are going through when they call us, and to ensure we don't get that compassion fatigue that, you know, if you're an officer and you're continually going to DA offences, it's possible that you can get a bit, you know, tired at times. So it's trying to make sure we do that. We, as Mandy said, when we get really good feedback, we feed that back to officers so that they are rewarded for, you know, taking that time for the listening and being recognised by a victim for that. I think the other thing is that I chair a user insight meeting where I look at where there are gaps, where we need to do more to hear the voice of communities or victims. And I know that CSD have been in touch with you because you do some of those focus groups that can add an extra layer to our understanding. And those findings will go into our PVP, our monthly PVP meeting, which then looks at what training do we give to officers on vulnerability next year and the year after, because we always have vulnerability training for officers to remind them of, well, to give them new learning, to make sure they've got the understanding, where there's new things that are working to make sure, or where there's new crimes, you know, so we did coercive and controlling behaviour 18 months ago. So, yeah, it's a constant process about making sure that officers learn from either local voice of victims or some of the findings that we know nationally that come out.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Okay, if we move on now then, and I'm conscious that we could talk about this all day because there's so much to it. So, you know, hopefully anyone watching will appreciate that we're trying to do as much as we can in the time we have. But if we move on then to talk about rape, thank you. And then Amanda.
Thank you. So this slide represents a picture in regard to rape crime and rape outcomes. With the country coming out of lockdown restrictions and the nighttime economy reopening in the city centre, which we refer to as E9, we anticipated an increase in volume of reports compared to the year of lockdown restrictions. So the previous 12 months are 14% higher in volume, equating to 1,361 crimes, compared to the 12 months before, which was 1,198. The previous 4 months have presented a sporadic picture in terms of volume. There was a spike in volume within September. However, this was a case involving one victim reporting 24 historic rape cases against several males. Therefore, the increases in offences can skew that perceived trend. Further to this, societal influences can highlight hidden victims of rape, such as the Me Too movement. Alongside changes in the criminal justice system in its approach to rape can also determine the trajectory of recorded rape offences. The cultural component to rape has a great influence on whether victims feel safe to come forward and report a crime, of which currently remains unpredictable. In terms of our most similar forces, just in case you don't know, our most similar forces are Cleveland, GMP, Northumbria, West Yorkshire, South Yorkshire and West Midlands. So in terms of our most similar forces, 6 of the 7 forces within our most similar force group experienced an increase in volume year on year. It was only West Yorkshire that had seen a very slight reduction of 11. As a force, the volume of crimes within Merseyside continues to be the second lowest within our most similar group. Only Cleveland recorded lower. And in terms of most similar group, Merseyside experienced a 10.8% increase year on year, compared to a 16.6% increase for the most similar group.
Do we know how outcome rates compare with most similar forces?
I haven't got that information on me at the moment, but we do know that we have a system called Foresight where we can look at outcome rates in our most similar group and also within the North West region, so I can get that to you.
Great, thank you. So in terms of the response then, in terms of outcomes, because obviously this is a national challenge, and we've seen the kind of widely published headlines around the outcome rate, conviction rates being the lowest ever. What is our approach to investigations for rape, and how are we working to try and increase that?
So we do have a dedicated unit to investigate rape called our Unity unit, and that unit has detectives and also specialised officers who will come alongside victims and help them to understand the process and ensure that all referrals are made, in terms of giving them sexual advocates as well to help them through the process. We are reviewing that unit at the moment, having done some benchmarking with other forces, and particularly I mentioned Bluestone before because that's a big national, well, it's 5 forces really trying to find best practice for investigating rape and ensuring that we improve outcomes, which is what we all want to do here. So we do have that dedicated unit, which some forces don't have, but is now being lauded as the way forward. And they're very experienced officers and very committed to that role as well. And we've got a review, which I know you know, Commissioner, because you're going to see some of the options in a few weeks' time around how we improve that unit. What we also are working very closely with the CPS. There's an end-to-end rape plan, and that means that we have bi-weekly meetings with the CPS where we look at cases that are being investigated. We've also, nationally, there's been put in pre-charge meetings, so that means the officers in charge meet up with a specialised lawyer, talk through some of the challenges, understand what's needed to be able to get a charge, and so they're preempting the sort of plans from the CPS. And then we have post-charge conferences as well, which means that straight after the charge, the lawyers and the officers are working hard to make sure they get all the evidence that's needed to get the case to court, and also try and speed up the investigation, because these are complicated crimes. There's often a lot of digital evidence. There may be a lot of CCTV evidence that's needed apart from forensic evidence. And so these crimes can take a long time to investigate. And of course, that leaves the victim waiting and, wondering how long it's going to take. So we're working with the CPS very closely. We also, I know that you fund 2 units that RASA and the RASA unit to help support victims, to provide counselling, to give advocacy. So we've got those units that are assisting as well with everything that we do. And we also make sure that all our officers have gone through the courses, the national courses, so that they're fully trained in how to investigate sexual offences.
Okay, thank you for that. I've got other kind of broader questions, but I think we'll go through some of the data and then we'll come to them at the end rather than repeating them. So do you want to move on to the other sexual offences?
Thank you, Commissioner. So this slide represents a picture in regard to other sexual crime and outcomes. Other sexual crimes contain offences of sexual assault and activity, exposure, engaging in communications with a child, grooming, voyeurism and abuse of position of power. The lockdown period observed a significant reduction in the volume of other sexual offences. However, recent months have shown subsequent rises in volumes to pre-lockdown levels and above. Cyber-enabled sexual offences, after peaking at 36% in April 2020, has now depleted to similar levels experienced prior to the lockdown period, plateauing at around 22% for the last 12 months. This depicts a transition in the methods offenders are using to conduct this form of offence, rather than an increase in other sexual offences as a whole. In relation to volumes of cases pertaining to non-recent offences, this has not been observed as an emerging trend. And new cases continue to be the most prominent, accounting for an average of 70% of other sexual offences. In terms of the crime rate, average volumes for the time period of September to October 2020 to 2021 observed a 19% increase, or 214 crimes more, comparative to the same time period in the previous year. For outcome rates, solved outcomes volume has on the whole remained largely consistent. However, we have in the last few months, since February 2021, seen increases in volume recorded for crimes. This has led to a reduction in the outcome ratio. Most similar force data, so for other sexual, volume has shown a 14.6% increase between September 2020 and August 21, in comparison with our MSG, which has shown a 17.2% increase. For solved outcomes, over the previous 12 months, the force stood at 11.5% solved, compared to our MSG, which shows a rate of 10.9%.
So, do we know the increase that we've had from February? Do we know what type of, is there a particular type of sexual offence that we're seeing as a result of the increase? Do we know why we're suddenly seeing a spike from February?
Sorry, Commissioner, I haven't got that information on me at the moment.
Commissioner, I do think that the opening up of the nighttime economy is a feature in this. It won't be the entirety, but similar to rape, there is sexual offences that get committed in the nighttime economy.
In terms of the proactive and kind of preventative approach, what are you doing to try and prevent sexual offences from occurring, particularly in relation to the nighttime economy?
Yeah, there's an incredible amount of work that Liverpool City Council are doing. I have to say, in terms of training, licensed premises around bystander training, some communication campaigns which are particularly pointing towards the perpetrators and ensuring that we're not victim blaming. We have an Operation Empower, that's actually been really successful around both plainclothes and uniform officers dedicated to looking out for sexual predators and making sure that people aren't taking advantage of people who are on their own and drunk. And we've had a number of arrests through that, which has been really successful. So there are a lot of there's a lot of activity, and with us and with partners around that, and ensuring that we have guardians as well, whether that's street pastors, etc. So there's a lot of work to make the nighttime economy as safe as possible for everyone to go out and enjoy it.
So obviously we've seen the increase in the reports of spiking as well. So I know there'll probably be a similar response in terms of. Sorry if I missed. Oh, sorry, John. I'm so sorry. I will come to you. But I suppose my question was going to be in relation, is there a similar response? Because obviously these issues are happening in that time economy as well. We're not aware there's any links to, are we seeing an increase in sexual offences as a result of the spiking? But in terms of the action you're taking, I assume there's a similar response in terms of working with partners and the Operation Empower and things.
Yeah, I'll let John answer, because I think his is the question before, and then I'll come in if there's anything further to say about the spiking.
Sorry, John, I keep missing your hand.
No, that's absolutely fine, Commissioner. Yeah, just to add to Nairi's update there. So we have now enhanced Operation Empower as well, so we can build on its success and cover broader areas. We've also enhanced our nighttime economy plan, so we've got more officers and staff on the ground, not just to keep people safe, but to actually make people feel safe, and that's in relation to a number of issues, including knife crime. We're deploying our randomised control trial, which puts extra staff in place under Operation Target, and I think you know, beyond the sort of extensive communications work that's been done, that there's work across each community safety partnership. So it's not just Liverpool, but each community safety partnership to develop and enhance their own nighttime economy operations. And you're obviously well aware of the work, the funding that's come through your office, and we've been successful in that for the Safer Streets work, which particularly impacts Wirral and to a degree Liverpool. And then most recently, Jan Tunster, our one of our members of staff who's written bids on behalf of Knowsley Local Authority that secured a significant amount of funding for Safer Streets work in Knowsley. So none of this is treated in isolation. It links into our enhanced operational work under Operation Adder, our county lines work, and our Operation Target and Redmond work, keeping people safe in its entirety in the nighttime economy. Spiking particularly, we're classifying that as a knife crime, and we classify injection spiking as a knife crime and a serious assault. So that is also subject to analysis and features under the Operation Interface Gold Group, which I lead on behalf of the Chief. And we're also bringing that into not just local policing, but the Violence Reduction Partnership in terms of longer term activities to support victims and prevent offending behaviour.
Yeah, and just to add to that around spiking, we've created a specialist investigation team, Operation Protect, that are taking all allegations of spiking and making sure they all get the same service. We've got a trigger plan in place so that officers know what they need to do if someone talks about spiking to ensure we get early evidence, whatever that may be, whether that's CCTV, whether that's seizing the drink, whether that's making sure that we've got forensic evidence as well. So we've got a really tight plan around getting all the evidence we can and then making sure we've got specialised investigators to investigate it and make sure we get any patterns and try and identify what drugs are being used, if they are being used, etc. And we're linking in with the national programme around that as well to ensure that there's a national understanding of the intelligence and what the patterns are around that.
But what we haven't, in answer to part of your question, what we haven't seen, Commissioner, is the correlation between spikings leading to sexual offending. We've obviously seen an increase in reports of spiking, but that is when people have become unwell as opposed to thinking that, that they've been subject to a sexual offence.
Okay, thank you. Now, my apologies to the member of the public who did submit this question about can anything be done about places without good lighting where sexual violence assaults are commonly happening, and in order to deter men from assaulting women in areas like this. I guess we've probably partly covered that with some of the work around Safer Streets and obviously Operation Empower. Is there anything in addition to address that you want to highlight that you've not already touched on? Either John, is that you?
Yeah, just come on and, you know, it's a really good tool, this, to help our understanding and to actually work in, particularly in partnerships, particularly across community safety partnerships, to address some of those issues. So we've had more than 60 responses through the Street Safe app at the minute. That all features into local policing performance and governance meetings. So we're on top of it. We know what's happening with those. The vast majority of them are environmental, but some relate to the deployment of policing and police resources. So we've acted on that where it needs a partnership approach for feeding it in and working out on it with community safety partnerships. So we'd encourage use of that Street Safe app so we can get that information where people, particularly women, are not feeling safe, and we're committed to act on it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, if we move on then to voyeurism as an exposure, I was keen to include this, I think particularly given in the wake of what happened with Wayne Couzens, but obviously, you know, there is a spectrum of violence and abuse against women, and we want to make sure that things like exposure and voyeurism are being taken as seriously as all other forms. So, Amanda?
Thank you. So this slide represents a picture in regard to exposure and voyeurism, crime and crime outcomes as well. So for the crime rate, prior to COVID, the average volume of crimes per month stood at 15 crimes. This slightly reduced during peak COVID restrictions to 12 crimes, but has returned to a more consistent level recently with a monthly average of around 16 crimes per month since February 2021. Although this appears to be a stark increase, the figure actually equates to an increase of 4 crimes. Voyeurism crime volumes have in the main remained consistent over the long-term period. In terms of the outcome rate, in the same date period, there has been 91 solved outcomes in respect of exposure and 21 solved outcomes for voyeurism. Unfortunately, in relation to most similar force detail, we don't have any details to compare on that particular crime type.
And I guess, again, there's probably similar challenges around identifying perpetrators and how we respond to that to try and, you know, nip that kind of behaviour in the bud early.
Yeah, we sort of, in addition to some of the other things I've said, we have a vulnerability desk in our Force Intelligence Bureau. So particularly for exposure, there will be analysis of the method of how the MO of that, and ensuring that any linked series are brought together. Where we have any names or descriptions, that will always go on briefings for local policing. So we really, local policing will work very hard, because obviously with exposure it's in a public place, so there often is opportunities to identify who the offender is. So this is a priority, and as I say, the vulnerability desk will ensure that we get that briefing out as quickly as possible and try and identify who's responsible for those offences.
Do you feel that officers take it seriously in terms of not encouraging people just to brush it off and just ignore, you know, silly man exposing himself? Do you feel like officers understand the kind of impact that'll have?
Yeah, officers are really aware that this is a precursor offence. That, you know, it may be a move from doing things online and it's a step to doing something worse. Officers know that, they're trained in that. I mean, what I haven't mentioned, obviously, is our sexual offences unit as well, which we recently increased the resourcing in there, and we're very tight on policing any orders around that and making sure local policing are aware as well. So in terms of people that have convictions, we're policing those conditions and making sure that local policing know who those people are. Again, linking in with the vulnerability desk to identify if something does happen, who that is. But I think officers do take this very seriously.
Just to reassure you, Commissioner, we've mentioned training a couple of times already. So the officers get 2 days vulnerability training, and that's refreshed frequently. It was developed with Lancaster University to make sure, and we cover all forms of vulnerability. So we developed a programme with Lancaster University, as I said, on stalking, harassment and coercive and controlling behaviour. But that was a half day, and we've added the day and a half in to cover all forms of vulnerability, so that as and when the changes come in legislation, officers have got that information. So it's a big commitment on behalf of the force, and we evaluate that every 6 months in terms of making sure it's current, it's relevant. We include things like victims' voice in there, so so people really do understand things from the victim's perspective, because it is such a vulnerability and violence against women and girls is such a priority for the force.
Great, thank you very much for that. And obviously the figures are still quite low just in terms of whether people report it, so that's probably an ongoing challenge as well. But that's good to hear the training. Okay, so we move on then to stalking and harassment.
Thank you. So for stalking crime, since its peak in May, Merseyside has observed a decrease of stalking recorded across the previous 3 months. Across the last 2 months, 89% of crimes had a domestic flag attributed to it. This is slightly lower than the previous month, seeing just about 90%. Of note, in relation to the long-term trend of stalking, since June 2020, a change to the recording of harassment was introduced, whereby all cases where a course of conduct is reported between a victim and their former partner must be recorded as stalking, unless the force crime registrar is satisfied that the matter amounts to harassment in law only. Most similar force detail available is that for stalking we are the lowest in our most similar group per 1,000 population at 2.39 crimes per 1,000. For harassment we are 5th out of 7 in our most similar group. We recorded 10.7 crimes per 1,000 population. For stalking outcomes, outcome 15 has decreased by 3 percentage points compared to the same period last year. and outcome 16 has increased by 6 percentage points compared to the same period last year. This outcome accounts for over half of all the outcomes for current financial year to date. Charged has decreased by 5 percentage points compared to the previous year. For harassment crime, the trend for Merseyside is relatively stable, showing an average of 1,297 crimes per month for the last 12 months. In Merseyside, for the last 12 months, the crime split is 84% for harassment and 55% for malicious communications. Most similar force detail available is that Merseyside is reflecting an harassment rate of 10.9 crimes per 1,000 population, ranking it in the second lowest in the most similar force group.
Okay. There was a particular issue raised with me around stalking prevention orders and Merseyside not using them as much as they possibly could be. Is that something that we are looking at trying to increase use of?
So we have had 3 stalking prevention orders. I think we've got 1 currently awaiting a court hearing, and we've got 2 others under consideration. So we do use these, and we do look at where it's possible to use them. The level of evidence required for a stalking prevention order is beyond reasonable doubt. So obviously, if you can prove that, you can often prove the offence. So they, we have looked at opportunities, but unless we can prove beyond reasonable doubt, when we would, want to prosecute for the offence and then have the order alongside it, it's difficult to progress these. That's not to say that we don't look at every opportunity, that we are working with our legal department around whenever there is an opportunity and taking advice from them, and we're taking learning from other forces. So it's there, officers know about it, they've been trained in it, we are scrutinising. The Chief talked about the crime scrutiny panel. We do scrutinise stalking as one of the crime areas and make sure that every opportunity is taken to protect and to prosecute.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions about stalking? No? Okay, if we move on then to child sexual exploitation.
Thank you. This slide relates to volumes and outcome rates pertaining to child sexual exploitation on Merseyside. I will refer to this as CSE during my commentary. It should be noted that the CSE crime flag for CSE-related offences is required, as CSE is not defined in law as a standalone offence. CSE cannot be identified using offence subclasses only, as some subclasses could be made up of CSE and non-CSE offences. As such, a flag is the only method for collecting this data. Given these 2 different definitions, CSE is a clearly defined subset of child sexual abuse, and so all offences flagged as being related to child sexual exploitation should also be flagged as child sexual abuse. Across Merseyside, there are vulnerable children who are repeatedly going missing from home. We know there is a strong correlation between children missing from care and those at risk of being sexually exploited. Methods used to draw young children into being exploited are via grooming methods such as online, boyfriend-girlfriend partnerships, parties, supply of drugs and alcohol. Analysis of crime trends have identified that the summer months appear to consistently show increases in the volume of these offences, with the month of June particularly experiencing rises in levels of non-recent crimes being reported. In terms of most similar force data, as previously mentioned, because it's use of a flag, it's difficult to establish comparisons with our MSF because there is no data accessible for this.
Does this not cause a lot of issues in terms of trying to track the issue nationally, when the government talks a lot about county lines and understanding, girls being exploited in that way, and obviously then boys got often being exploited? How are we monitoring this nationally then? Sorry.
Yeah, Commissioner, I've got the national lead around this. Is something I've been discussing over the last few days with it. We have enhanced our ability to understand what the national picture is. We have invested in analysts that sit in the regional organised crime units in each area across the country, so we're able to understand, particularly around group-based offending, the totality at work. We work with the NCA in relation to, again, understanding the totality of all child abuse, recognising that group-based offending is probably around 3 or 4% of the totality of offending, the majority of which continues to be perpetrated by members of the family as well, and an ever-increasing number of referrals that we are calling peer-on-peer abuse. And you saw, obviously, the impact of the Everyone's Invited campaign, which subsequently led to over 100,000 testimonials being submitted as well. So the issue which policing has stepped forward on is that CSE in itself is not the crime type, so the recording of it is crimes that are then perpetrated within what we call exploitation, whether that's abduction, rape or sexual offences of children. But we have made massive strides forward to understand what is the picture, and therefore we can then determine how do we prevent it and how do we best provide a service for children who have been perpetrated against him. Work is replicated in Merseyside. You know around what we do in Merseyside around the MACE procedure, for example, that within each locality area led by the Head of Public Protection, we're able to share information dynamically, both in terms of the child and the safeguarding that's required of the child, but also in terms of those that perpetrate against that child and making sure there is a good safeguarding plan in place, as well as robust investigation to bring offenders to justice. The other element which I would raise is that you raised before about the increased number of sexual offences, some of which is clearly being perpetrated online, either in terms of a sexual offence that's being committed online or that is using the online platform to commit a live contact offence. We replicate the position in Merseyside with that as the national position. There is an inordinate amount of work and investment in this area, again with NCA and with other partners. We've invested in force around our online child abuse investigation team. Their demand is ever increasing, sadly, but some of the offences that they have investigated have been outstanding. Some of them have been thoroughly traumatic, hugely sad for victims. We are also investing in our UCOL teams, our undercover online teams, because what we are doing there is clearly seeking to identify the perpetrator before, ideally, they identify a live child to abuse. And again, our regional organised crime units have had investment in them. That then leads, obviously, to an investigation by the local force to identify the perpetrator prior to them committing offences against children and the lifelong harm that comes. There's an inordinate amount of work, much more to do. Sadly, it's an increase in demand, particularly based on the online platforms. The only addition I would say is, from a national perspective, the key area of preventing that is the online safety bill. And we are pushing massively in terms of making sure, if that is going to have the teeth that it needs, and I've got a meeting tomorrow chairing a national meeting where Ofcom sit on that, then we need to have a good regulatory platform that sits behind that can absolutely hold some of these huge companies, these social media companies, to account, and it makes a difference as well. The key bit of that is seeking to prevent the encryption element, whereas there will be the arguments around right to privacy against, but I would argue all day long that the right to protect a child and the right to protect life would outdo that privacy argument all day long. But that is something that is being discussed. It's going through Parliament, as you know, and would welcome your backing around that. It is absolutely essential that we're able to that companies will only be able to fulfil their obligation if they can see what is taking place on their platforms. With end-to-end encryption, they will not be able to do that.
Yeah, it's a good point you raise, and I think it's something that I know, police and other security agencies have struggled with for a while in terms of being able to get access to where they know people are causing the harm. And certainly, I think we need to be calling much more on social media companies to play their role in stopping these things from taking place on their platforms. So it's definitely something to make sure that, as you say, the online harms bill actually has the teeth it needs to do what needs to be done. Okay, thank you for that. You answered all the questions I had written down, so thank you. Right, if we move on now then to, is it murder and homicide?
Thank you. So this slide represents the picture in relation to homicide, which is also a national measure, so I'll discuss that a little bit later on as well in that context. The term homicide includes murder, manslaughter and infanticide. For the financial year to date, 21-22, the total number of homicides stands at 9. 6 are non-domestic and 3 domestic. This data excludes any recent crime. In regard to MSF data, again, unfortunately, we're not able to get hold of the national comparative data with specific breakdowns, such as whether they were against a female or domestic related. Domestic murders with a female victim can vary year on year. The latest data indicated a makeup of around 67% compared to 2020, when the makeup was 50%. For context, over the past 5 years, there have been a total of 3 females murdered by a stranger. This is whereby the victim-offender relationship is specifically given as a stranger within the crime record. In regard to domestic homicide reviews, 5 reviews are awaiting Home Office publication, and there are a further 9 cases that have been referred for consideration, of which 6 are suicides.
So apologies, so what percentage of all homicides were domestic?
Sorry,
for the, I guess, the period we're looking at. Well,
so it depends which year we're looking at. So, for example, for the 2021-22 period, there were 10 homicides in all. Of that, 3 were domestic and 7 were non-domestic.
Okay. So in terms of the so the point I was going to make was, but we can't compare that nationally, because that seems bonkers.
Yes, we can compare homicide nationally, but the makeup of domestic and non-domestic, female, male, we can't compare. There isn't a site we can go to get that information from unless we do a benchmarking exercise.
So going back to the earlier discussion around domestic abuse is recorded as a flag as opposed to a crime type.
Yes.
So there's no easy way to compare it.
No, with homicide we can compare numbers, but not the detail underneath it.
So do we know how we compare in terms of numbers of homicide versus across the board to other similar forces?
I haven't got that information, no,
Okay.
but we are able to get that from our foresight system.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then in terms of the domestic homicides, which, you know, I think do make up a significant proportion, is there any learning that's come out of the domestic homicide reviews that we now have to take place every time somebody is murdered in that way?
Yeah, obviously we are involved in a number of domestic homicide reviews. The big learning that's come out has been evidence-led prosecutions. So where we've had previous contact, they tend to have not ended up in a prosecution, and that learning is being shared with officers as we speak. That's the part of the DA intensification. We've got an example of a murder that took place in 2018 where there were more might have been able to be done in terms of evidence-led prosecutions, and we've got the family talking as well, so it really brings it home to officers looking at evidence-led prosecutions. That is the key finding. We have got other findings that don't sort of link across. Whenever we get that learning, that is shared and put into place. So, and generally before the actual, well, always before the publication, because once we identify learning, we'll put that in place.
And it's my understanding then that the domestic homicides that we tend to see relate to the kind of low and medium risk victims who quite often haven't reached the threshold of having that wraparound support. What are we doing to try and make sure that we're identifying those and preventing them from becoming domestic homicides?
Yeah, we do have in the last few years a couple that were golds, but generally they are either not known to us or bronze cases. Obviously, the merit risk assessment does have academic rigour behind it. We actually put more people through to Marek as golds per 1,000 population than anywhere else in the country. So we do put a tremendous amount of people through. obviously the thing with prevention is you don't know what you've prevented, do you? So if those goals hadn't been put through as Marek and got that, would they have been domestic homicide reviews? So I think, you know, we can't change our risk assessment for each person, because that merit risk assessment has gone through academic rigour, and the Mareks generally are in place and supported nationally by Safe Lives. So any learning from those domestic homicide reviews we do put into the force, but in terms of, we can't give every domestic violence victim an IDVA, because we haven't got the, you know, there just isn't the money for that. And lots of them are very low level. You know, we get domestic reports of where someone's kid won't get off the PS5. We get some that are about sort of Facebook comments, and I don't think those victims are asking for that wraparound. So, you know, there's a whole, it's a real big spectrum, domestic crime. What we do is make sure that wherever there is a crime, that is always recorded and that is always investigated. And we never don't do that. But, you know, not every, there isn't really high risk with every domestic crime that gets recorded.
I would just go back to the point that, you know, absolutely, it's very clear within the organisation that there's a priority around vulnerability, a priority against violence against women and girls, and a priority of domestic abuse. It's been a priority, you know, for the 5 years that I've been in the force. I think every officer and member of staff that, you know, you would speak to in terms of the DA, the domestic abuse intensification periods that we do, in terms of the dedicated DA sergeants that we've had in place who scrutinise domestic abuse incidents that our response staff are going out to deal with, the work that we've done with academia to make sure that the training that we are doing has got academic rigour to it, making sure that we take on board best practice and the learning from domestic homicide reviews to absolutely make sure it's very, very clear that when officers are attending, it is dealt with by way. And when I say priority, I'm not talking about the way we grade it. I'm talking that, I mean, in terms of that domestic abuse is a priority for the force.
Okay, thank you. If we move on then to honour-based abuse and female genital mutilation.
Thank you. So this chart provides the monthly trends for honour-based abuse, forced marriages and female genital mutilation crime. The numbers are very low within each category. From September 2020 to September 2021, there were 25 crimes of honour-based abuse, 1 crime of forced marriage, 1 crime of female genital mutilation. Since the beginning of the calendar year, there have been recorded 6 intelligence submissions, the majority of which pertain to forced marriage, and 31 occurrences categorised as honour-based violence. The majority of those recorded relate to controlling behaviour by the victim's partner. Other themes include family abroad threatening females in the UK due to their choice of lifestyle. Another trend includes females being threatened by parents due to disclosing that they are not heterosexual.
So I guess the big concern around this is just the numbers are so low, and I guess there's still a real concern around reporting. And is there anything we're doing to try and encourage in terms of the partner agencies? Are we doing enough to encourage them to look out for these signs?
You'll know, Commissioner, that I have a quarterly meeting around honour-based abuse, which is on a day of meetings all around violence against women and girls, and that we have a number of agencies at that meeting to look at how we can encourage reporting and ensure that we are picking up the signs, any signs. The last meeting we did do a presentation about a specific case. We also, with Severa, provide training to the police with Severa, provide training to partners in the safeguarding boards, and we've done quite a lot of training around that. So we are continuing to raise the agenda, and we're available for any of the safeguarding partners to call on that training. So in that way, we're pushing it, and we will continue to do that. It is important that partners are alive to it, and that where they have a suspicion, they know where to report to, and that it's then, you know, dealt with appropriately, and that will continue.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm conscious that we are due to have a break, but before we do, I just wanted to have a brief conversation around police conduct and complaints. I guess in the wake of Sarah Everard in particular, there is a kind of, I guess, an anxiety out there amongst women around the trust and confidence in police to report a number of the crimes that we've been talking about. So in terms of responding to some of those concerns, what are some of the measures that you might have put in place to make sure that women feel safe when they are encountering police officers, for example?
So, in light of the conviction of the murderer of Sarah Everard, you know, we put out advice to members of the public in terms of how they could seek that reassurance around officers. In general, our officers, when they're working in plain clothes, are doubly crewed. But if officers are single crewed, then to ask to see a copy of the warrant card, ask them to all should have radios with them, so ask them to radio into the control room. If people are still not happy, to actually ring into the control room themselves. The same actually for uniformed staff. You know, the same advice was given. So we gave that advice out, you know, via all of our external media channels, and then internally I gave the same advice out to our staff, and did, you know, a couple of video pieces to camera around. We understand the impact that this has had on our communities. You know, we're horrified as a policing community as it is, but actually to have some patience with our communities. We accept and completely understand the way people are feeling. So to please expect some additional questions around verification. So we've done it both internally to our staff, but also externally, giving that advice out to members of our community.
Okay, thank you for that. And then in terms of police officer conduct then, do we know how many cases there are of police officers that have been reported for committing offences around sexual violence or domestic abuse?
Commissioner, we've dealt with 38 referrals in 5 years now, the majority of which domestic abuse cases, some of which on members of the public, some of which on colleagues as well. We track all those through. Clearly, they take a high priority. They are investigated, if they are crime offences, investigated by dedicated professional investigators from public protection units working with the professional standards department. There have been a number of convictions at court in relation to those, and also dismissals from the organisation. Clearly, a key part of that is our enhanced vetting work. We comply with national vetting processes, but we are in the process of reviewing that. When cases are referred to us, we ask both the public and colleagues to refer and be confident in reporting to us anonymously if need be to us, and there is a high priority placed in relation to how then we deal with victims, whether that is colleagues in the workplace or members of the public, and we track through those investigations working with the IOPC as well as CPS in terms of criminal and conduct offences. We're also obviously working with members of your team in relation to protecting women, particularly women in the workplace, particularly from domestic abuse, raising up awareness and indeed confidentiality of reporting, and work that we are doing with that wider violence against women and girls agenda in terms of changing overarching behaviour, both in terms of that towards colleagues, but also to members of the public. The chief, indeed, only today has been working with colleagues in terms of sending messages out. And we must recognise that the majority of our staff do a fantastic job every single day, and do it in a way with care, with compassion, and with empathy, but we know that those times where that is not displayed, that can impact how the public feel, but also how the colleagues feel, and that is an absolute commitment in terms of where we want to be as a service, that colleagues feel trusted, respect each other, treat people with empathy, and if we are truly going to deliver community first policing, that our public do on each and every occasion. But where it is breached, where that trust is breached, we will absolutely take the required action to, as we've seen recently, remove people from our organisation. And what is pleasing, and I use that in a careful way, is that colleagues feel confident to report, knowing how we will treat them in order to remove those people from our organisation.
No, that's good. That's very positive to hear about how seriously you take those behaviours and the kind of commitment to rooting it out. In terms of what some people have called the kind of lower level behaviours, you know, where it's sexist jokes or, you know, inappropriate comments, do you feel like you're embedding the right culture in terms of encouraging people to report those things or challenge them, and supervisors backing up people who challenge them and those kind of issues?
Yeah, I've been very clear since, you know, becoming the chief 8 months ago around behaviours and what is acceptable. I've done lots of internal comms in recent months. We're also launching a leadership framework. Now, the leadership framework is for everybody within the organisation, not just leaders, because you know, for me, leadership starts with self and our behaviours, and a big thrust of that is our behaviours, so how we treat each other. It links very much to our just principles, which are based on the Code of Ethics from the College of Policing. And also, so it starts with talking around how we treat each other and how we behave, but it also talks around creating that a culture where we have the confidence to speak out when we see behaviours that are not in line with that leadership framework, to speak out, to call out that behaviour and to raise it. So there's a lot of work going on internally within the organisation at the moment around those standards of behaviour, linking to kind of the Vogue agenda, but also linking to our inclusion agenda around wanting to make sure that Merseyside Police is representative of our communities, and therefore we need to work really hard around the way in which we treat each other.
Good, thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to suggest, because I realise we're running a bit late, if we have a 5-minute break now, if we can stop recording, please. And then we'll come back, and I'm conscious we've got one more on that slide, and then we'll pick up the rest of it. welcome back, everybody. So we have got one more slide that we're going to look at in terms of supporting victims, which is around hate crime. Again, a very topical issue at the minute, and then we'll move on to the next bit. So, Amanda?
Thank you. So moving on to hate crime, this crime always has seasonality every year, with the summer months recording increased volumes. The increase was exacerbated during the pandemic, where volumes were lower than usual with lockdown restrictions again and minimal nighttime economy. There's been a large drive around hate crime this year in terms of ensuring reporting through media drives, encouraging people to come forward and feel more confident. We did see between June and August an increase in sexual orientation hate, particularly which was heavily in the media. We do anticipate this month to be an increase due to the recent terror attacks. This is being monitored daily, and any anomalous data is being flagged to chief officers. The main crime offence group within hate continues to be public order, accounting for, on average, 52% across the last 12 months. The last 3 months have been slightly higher, at around 57% of hate being public order. Second highest is stalking and harassment, and on average, this has been around 21%. However, it has fallen slightly to around 17% in the last 2 months. Violence without injury is around 10% of these crimes, and violence with injury accounts for around 7%. For outcomes, the most common outcome for current financial year to date is outcome 16, once again. Outcome 16 has decreased by 2 percentage points compared to the same period in 2020. And we do not have any data for MSF, again, because it's a hate crime flag that we use for comparisons.
So the fact that the outcome 16 has dropped, is that good because we're seeing less people withdraw the complaints, withdraw the crime reports? Right, okay, so that's positive, isn't it? And then I guess in terms of outcomes, obviously I guess there's been a bit of a drop in outcomes, partly because of the increase in reporting, but what work are we doing to tackle hate crime? I guess is my question.
Yeah, in terms of outcomes, we have hate crime coordinators in each of the hubs. So we have someone who looks at every hate crime and makes sure that they're being investigated appropriately. Obviously, we dedicate detectives to look at these crimes as well. We have a trigger plan, so there's an expectation that uniform officers will attend, and an understanding about sort of scene management, evidence gathering. I feel like I'm repeating myself from previous, but also advice to give to victims, and you yourself commission some support around hate crime for hate crime victims. We ensure that we deploy CSIs so that we take every opportunity to get evidence if that's available. But in terms of sort of prevention, which I guess your question was also going over to, you'll know, and part of that rise is around sexual orientation and some problems there were at the beginning of the summer opening up. And I know that, I'm surprised John hasn't already got his hand up, but he runs a partnership group to make sure that we're working with other partners and ensuring that we where there's series, that we do everything we can, both to prevent further crime, but to also to encourage reporting, actually. It's really important that people feel confident to come to us and to know that we'll take it seriously. And we know when we look at some victim feedback, sometimes people say, well, I didn't think anyone would be interested, and almost normalise that behaviour, and we don't want that. We want people to report it. Similarly, we have a digital management investigation unit that monitors different sites. We've been doing that particularly after the counter-terrorism to make sure that we identify online hate crime, and we'll continue to do it after the awful events of the last week, particularly with Ava White. So there's a lot of things we do to go out and look for it, and also to encourage victims to come forward. And I know John's put on his camera, so I'll hand to him That's okay.
John?
Thanks. Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. Thanks, Nari. I think Nari's given a really full and comprehensive answer there, but I'd just add to that in terms of, you know, some of the most important work that we do is around community cohesion, and that's absolutely at the heart of neighbourhood policing for us. And if you look at some of the work that's been done in our most diverse communities, led on particularly by Inspector Dave Uren, there's a huge range and a depth of activity that's gone on for numerous years to build community trust and confidence. And it links into some of the questions we'll come on to later on around search. But we've also been supported by the Chief in uplifting the community engagement unit now. So we've uplifted the number of officers and staff who are in our community engagement unit to help drive some of that central team. It links into the work in the inclusion team. So organisationally, it was a real focus and a real enhanced approach to community cohesion. But operationally as well, as Nari described, we were really quick to get a grip, or to seek to get a grip around the homophobic attacks that we saw in the city centre earlier on this year. Wrapped a gold group around that. A lot of work done in partnership and a lot of agencies around the table, each contributing to that community safety partnership. And then particularly after the bomb attack at the Women's Hospital recently, we would anticipate a significant rise in hate crime, and that didn't actually transpire. And I actually think that is in part due to some of that really positive work that police and partners put into the communities right from the get-go around reassurance, prompt action, and that dedicated and focused monitoring. What we didn't see was a significant rise in hate crime that we could link to Al-Samain's detonation of the bomb at the Liverpool Women's Hospital.
Yeah, I think that's been very positive actually in terms of how well the community have come together and supported each other. So it's reassuring that we haven't seen that spike yet, although obviously, you know, continuing to monitor it is helpful. In terms of the different types of hate crimes, again, we mentioned the LGBT kind of spike that we saw over the summer. Am I right in thinking that disability hate crime is quite low? Is there still a real issue about that being reported in terms of, Nari, what you were saying about it just being an acceptable part of that delivery? Is there anything in particular we're doing around the different forms of hate crime for different groups?
So I can talk around what proportions there are within the hate crime. So the highest proportion is racial, and that's at 61%. That's followed by sexual orientation, and that's at 22%. And then disability at 9%. Moving on from there is religious, that's at 3%. And then 3% again for transgender. And finally, sex worker, monthly average around 2%.
Yeah, disability is low, and we want to encourage people to come forward and to recognise it as a crime. Our hate crime coordinators do inputs into different groups, and I know that the community engagement unit does a lot of work as well with different communities, including disabled communities, and encourage them to report. But I think we'd like to see that increase.
Okay, thank you. So then a question from the public was specifically around the work with hate crime recorded against sex workers. Am I right in thinking Merseyside is the only force, or certainly the first force, to record hate crimes against sex workers? What's the work being done around that?
Yeah, we're doing where crime is committed against sex workers, we do put a flag on so that it's recorded as a hate crime, and we are the first force to do that. We've been helped in around that with Red Umbrella, Safe Lives, who have been a real support to encourage and support sex workers to report crimes against them, and that has been really successful, and we've actually seen some excellent prosecutions as a result of that. We'll continue that work. I know there's an issue about sustainable funding for Safe Lives, which will, Changing Lives, that we continue to work with them to try and find that, that it's not year-on-year funding, but we've seen real benefits and the ability to be able to support sex workers who can be very vulnerable because of that work and because of that recording.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thank you for that. If we move on then to the second pillar around safer communities, so starting with ASB.
Okay, so the daily average for antisocial behaviour volumes resides at about 80 incidents per day. The pandemic no doubt impacted upon the volume of antisocial behaviour incidents, as can be seen by the spikes in the graph. The increases we experienced during the lockdown periods were commonly relating to large gatherings or breaking of COVID regulations, COVID rules. The longer-term trend for antisocial behaviour financial year to date has shown that volumes are presenting as consistently below the daily average, with the nuisance category remaining the largest of antisocial behaviour incidents. Scrambler bikes and Operation Brookdale is discussed within the next slide. Okay, so the antisocial behaviour brought about by scrambler bikes usage on Merseyside is also monitored within a formal governance process, and the operation which drives the performance in this area is referred to as Operation Brookdale. Incidents of scrambler bike antisocial behaviour have continued to decrease slightly from 523 in August to 501 in September, which is a decrease of 4.1%. We experienced a total of 597 cases in March this year, which currently remains the highest for this year. Seasonal trends suggest incidents should decrease over the coming months leading up to the new year. And based on the last 3 years, decreases have been experienced in Knowsley and Liverpool, with St Helens remaining fairly static, but Wirral and Sefton have experienced small increases. It's worthy of note as well to mention e-scooters. So of note, we've also completed some work in relation to the use of electronic scooters. We completed a review earlier in the year to look at the impact of e-scooters for the period September 2020 to May 2021, when there had been a total of 258 crimes reported with an e-scooter or an e-bike mentioned in the offence that actually related to an offence. So not surprisingly, the majority of offences have occurred within the Liverpool area, which had seen large increases. Looking at the crime types, the most common type of offence was linked to drugs possession and use. We also identified that drug possession and use and public order offences are currently on an increasing trend. The majority of the drug offences were related to offenders being stopped on the scooters or the bike, and a Section 23 search being conducted and then being found in possession of cannabis.
Thank you for that. Can I ask then just specifically on that last point around the e-scooters and the e-bikes? This is obviously something that has been raised a lot with me from members of the public because it's such a hotspot issue and we have seen a huge increase over the last couple of years. Are we confident that officers are proactive, you know, not necessarily just searching for drugs, but the general nuisance behaviour of bikes on pavements, and are officers kind of alive to that and being proactive to stop it and tackle it? John, do you want to come in?
Yes. Thanks, Commissioner. I'll come on that. Absolutely, we're proactive across the force in respect of that. And I think if you look at two elements really, so first off, we take the voice scheme in Liverpool, which obviously is a joint combined authority city council approach, and you know, you've got to support that in terms of the green agenda, but it did lead to a significant amount of antisocial behaviour with the users of these bikes, and Voy were very responsive on that one, and what we did was work with the company to put curfews on the use of those bikes, prevent them being used in the nighttime economy, and a lot of work around the locations which they're stored and picked up and how that is managed. On top of that, we have Operation Mute in force, which is a preventative approach to tackling the wider use of electric scooters by members of the public generally, which, as you're aware, that on any public road or pavement they're unlawful to ride, and there's been a significant amount of enforcement activity, arrests made, scooters seized, and prosecutions for everything from dangerous driving through to drink and drug driving, and then linking into other crime types which Amanda's described. I think that fits in then generally to the overall approach to antisocial behaviour, and what you can see is that fall over time, a real grip on this. Our lead is Duncan Swan, Chief Inspector at Knowsley, and every day antisocial behaviour incidents are assessed by each local policing team working with their local authority counterparts, and we take that preventative and problem solving approach to repeat victims and repeat locations, so there's no complacency for us despite the fact it's falling.
Great, thank you, that's good to hear. Do we know how we compare to other similar forces? Sorry, Amanda, no, we don't have that data.
Sorry, no. Not on the e-scooter. Antisocial behaviour is also a difficult one as well. And I don't think we have comparisons for antisocial behaviour. I might be wrong, but I'll check that out. Certainly not for e-scooters or e-bikes.
Okay, that's great. Any other questions? I had one other question about dispersal orders. I don't know whether, John, this is a question for you or the Chief, in terms of obviously dispersal orders have been used to some effect. They are kind of controversial in some contexts. Are we happy that they're kind of been used to good effect, and are they, you know, tackling some of the ASB that we do see? I don't know who wants to come in, John.
Perhaps if I come in, and then if the Chief wants to add anything. So we've used dispersal zones on 94 occasions in the last 12 months, and we don't use them lightly. That seems like quite a significant number. They're authorised by the local policing inspectors in response to intelligence or conduct, which causes issues for the community around antisocial behaviour or crime types in areas. What we do then is we monitor the number of times the dispersal orders are used, and we link the effectiveness assessment into our overall antisocial behaviour work. And in each case, you know, we're really happy that we have that grip and oversight on it, and we take the learning from it. And it is one of those tools that we're using to drive down that overall level of antisocial behaviour. But we do realise that these are impactive and can be impactive on communities, but particularly can be impactive on young people within them. And what we don't see, despite our use of the orders, what we're not seeing is any increase in our arrests of children, and by that I mean under 18s. And in fact, the numbers of arrests of children continues to fall, and we put a number of measures in place to prevent them becoming criminalised by our use of the powers, most notably the deferred prosecutions work, our use of body-worn cameras to interview at scene for any offences disclosed, and community resolution. So I'm really happy that not only it links into a reduction in antisocial behaviour, it's not linked to any kind of over-criminalisation or increase in criminalisation of children and young people.
Okay, good, thank you. So overall, it seems like quite a positive story in terms of ASBs actually falling, which is a great, great result. I can imagine that if I spoke to members of the public, they would say that's not their experience. And I don't know if that's because it's a lack of reporting or because we're criming it differently. But in terms of officers out on the streets and being proactive, I guess, and not, not being deterred by the fact that reports might seem like they're going down. I do know that I still get reports from the public that say that it's still a problem. So that's obviously something that you're still mindful of.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that goes back to the level of scrutiny that we have on a local basis. So local policing areas scrutinise their antisocial behaviour on a daily basis and respond to it. Very much the role of neighbourhood teams, and we continue to invest in our neighbourhood policing teams. We've most recently uplifted, particularly with the creation of the Kirby neighbourhood team. So that is the first responder on the ground to deal with ongoing or issues of antisocial behaviour, and we're absolutely committed to that. I think you can see it in our approach, and as I say, there's no complacency on it. We pick up on repeat locations, we pick up on repeat offenders, and actually what we should be doing is making, or we have done, certainly over the last 12 months, is make it easier to report. With the advent of single online home, it's much easier to report via the internet without having to ring 111 or 999. So actually we've increased the avenues that the members of the public are able to report to us. And of course then there's third party reporting through Community Safety Partnership ASB arrangements.
Great, thank you for that. Okay, right, if we move on now to modern slavery. Amanda?
Thank you. So this is the modern slavery picture across Merseyside. Figures for modern slavery tend to fluctuate due to the national referral mechanism. The national referral mechanism is a framework for identifying and referring potential victims of modern slavery and ensuring they receive appropriate support. It's an online platform. There have been a number of policing joint intelligence initiatives in partnership with other agencies, focusing on this area of business as well. In September 2021, the majority of modern slavery offences recorded were related to requiring a person to perform compulsory labour, which is an observed long-term trend. We've also completed some analysis late last year with the aim of enhancing our understanding of modern slavery in Merseyside. This culminated in the identification of over 20 key factors which I'm not going to go through, but I will make mention of a few of them if that's okay with you, Commissioner. So just a few that I've picked out. So what we identified is most commonly the victim is a looked after child. Victims are recruited overseas, usually by organised crime groups or seemingly legitimate agencies who promise to arrange transport to the UK as well as food, board and well-paid employment and accommodation. The majority of modern slavery offences, which is about 34%, can be attributed to county lines. Again, there's a lot more to share with you, Commissioner, but I can send that to you separately rather than go through them all on this occasion.
Thank you. I suppose we have to be careful with the idea of including county line. I understand why we do it, because they are literally being trafficked from one area to another to commit a crime, but it's a very different issue to, I think, the broader issue of modern slavery. In terms of the figures there, do you feel like we are getting the true picture around, you know, reports of modern slavery within Merseyside? I don't know who's the lead for this one.
Yeah, I'm the lead for this one. I think about 4.4% is county lines, isn't it? So
But we just said 34%.
I think 34% of the county lines is children. I can't remember what it was now, but it's not a huge amount. It is a subsection, because this counts the amount of referral mechanisms. So obviously, if you've got a child that is part of county lines and has been moved, then you will put an NRM in, because if they're going to go to court, that is part of their mitigation. So, you know, I'm quite comfortable that we have got a number of categories, and Mandy didn't read it all out because there's so much, but if we look at some of the we've got 18% is labour exploitation, and I think 34% of that might be the county lines, to be honest. 74% are foreign nationals. So it isn't, you know, this isn't all about county lines, although that's part of that. There's sexual exploitation is 7.7%. So there, we do have the figures, and domestic servitude is only 2.8%. So you can see we have had the analysis. We do understand what it's made up of. And I'm quite confident that we are picking up the foreign national part of this, as well as the sort of county lines and moving children about.
And then in terms of the kind of forced response to it, and particularly in terms of safeguarding victims, what's the approach there?
Yeah, so obviously we do have child exploitation teams in each of the hubs, and we also have Operation Medusa, which is the county lines operation. So in terms of young people who are being exploited, we have processes in place, and they will be referred through to the multi-agency child exploitation meetings within the local authorities. So that's how we deal with the children. We have Operation Sanctuary for the adults, which is a small team that assists detectives who have sort of picked up someone, whether it's a car wash or it's someone at a cannabis farm, etc. So they'll assist in those investigations. They have developed training, so we have quarterly training for the detectives who are likely to pick this up, and also to communicate to the local policing teams so that they can spot the signs of what might be exploitation. They also work with the border agencies and immigration, so they have quarterly meetings with them. And recently we have been given a task from the National Crime Agency around improving the intelligence collection of this. So we now have an intelligence collection plan and have temporarily put an analyst in to really look at it and make sure we understand, as Mandy mentioned, that we understand where the problems are. Obviously, that's partly in reaction to what's been all over the news for the last 2 weeks with these boats coming in, because actually that does affect us as well, not in terms of having boats, But those people who come in, if they then go for an asylum interview in Merseyside, the NRM will be put forward and that will hit our figures, which may actually be one of the reasons why September is higher. Well, it is one of the reasons why September is higher. So it does impact on us in Merseyside, albeit they'll be the ones that don't get picked up on the border, obviously, as they come in through Dover. So, yeah, it's complex. There's lots of different facets of it. We have a dedicated team. We've just put a dedicated intelligence team in place to make sure we're doing everything we can to understand the intelligence and feed that back into the national picture.
Great, thank you. Okay, if we move on now then to stop and search. Oh, sorry, John. Go on, John. Sorry, I keep not spotting. It's a tiny little hand on this big screen.
I'll just put my video on in future, perhaps. But just to add to what Nari said, linking that work into the modern slavery work into the county lines